This is a Pasco Media production. Please visit pascomedia.com.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show where we explore the miraculous nature of the mundane as we look at one part of the Catholic tradition to help you engage more fully in the practice of faith. Past episodes are available at renovopodcast.com. I'm Doug Tuke, and today we dilly-dabble with Catholic schools. This ought to get some good emotion going. You know, you diehard Catholic school fans will get upset, and you non-Catholic school fans will say, oh, and then the non-Catholic school fans will go, oh, I didn't know that. And the Catholic school fans will be like, oh, man, I didn't know that either. Because, you know, that's what we're all about at Renovo, is what we don't know. So here's what I want to do. I went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 5th grade, All Saints Elementary in Puyallup, Washington, and Montessori in Bonnie Lake, Washington. And I had a mixed review on that experience. I had great teachers, the most saintly women on the planet. And then I had just kind of a mixed review about my time there. And I want to expand on that later on, but I want to really get into the grit of the history of Catholic education. Because sometimes there's kind of like a blind advocacy, you know, where people are just like, no, if it's not Catholic school, it's crap. My kids should go. And then there's other people that are like, yeah, you know, whatever works for you. So I'm pretty open-minded about it, but man alive, people get defensive. So let's get into the history. Timothy Walsh wrote a book way back when, 1996, Parish School, American Catholic Parochial Education from Colonial Times to Present. And it's really good. And I want to get into that book as some of the background, but then talk about the now, because 96 was a while ago, and Catholic schools have changed a little bit. So let's do that. So here's the thing, and look, we got to start here. When you're trying to understand anything, all right, you got to look into like its origins specifically. Okay, so we got to consider the nature of education, what it means to educate, and especially with just kind of the changing contours of society, okay? It's rooted in investigation specifically, okay? Because you can't just say, oh, it's always been that way. This is the way it ought to be, or let's go back to the way it was, because there's a lot of changes, a lot of social differences going backwards into the quality of education. And that's what Tim Walsh does in his book. He offers this like comprehensive historical study of the origins and the growth of Catholic schools in America. Okay, so he acknowledges this is a really important story, but it's really kind of one of the most neglected ones in the church. It's a story about sacrifice, just unbelievable heroic commitment to individuals within the church, and it's really kind of brought to life by this conviction that education is really important, one of the most important things we can give to our kids, and that it's really a privilege. And it's the responsibility of the family and the church to cherish that. That's really what Walsh is saying in his book. And he starts out by talking about the Spanish and French missionary efforts way back when, which, you know, however fruitless they may have seemed, they were nonetheless pretty heroic. Okay, we did a show on black robes. We talked a lot about early missionary activity in the United States. But it was with this experience of Catholic colonists that faced a life in the New World that was even more anti-Catholic a lot of times than what they had left behind. And that was not anticipated. And that was true all the way up to the 19th century, which introduced about 5 million immigrant Catholics into American culture and society. So it dramatically forever alters the life and the work of the church. I mean, the United States, boom, lots of people come. So one of the most significant factors in the history of American Catholic schools, the immigrants really kind of prompted this sort of like new image of Catholic and foreign, okay? The way the church was understood. And that led to a lot of like violent confrontations. And that really reverberated for generations, okay? That wasn't just like one moment. So common public schools arose in this sort of effort to kind of safely homogenize foreigners into American society. And you got to remember, it was a very Protestant American society, but public schools, they kind of failed to understand that there were fundamental differences between U.S. at the time assumptions about church teaching and then those of the Catholic Church. It just wasn't the same. So not only did these kind of common public schools sort of alienate foreign Catholic immigrant kids from their religious, cultural, and like their family, like the heritage, right? They also kind of started from this assumption that education should belong to the state. And that was not accepted by the church. that education is a state-run industry. It's really important to understand that because the church really stepped up and said, wait a minute, no, we can do this in a certain way, okay? So the one thing that Walsh talks about that everyone kind of agreed is schools are certainly important, okay? But that the future belongs to the people who really kind of control the schools. Think about that profound concept where we are educating young people generation after generation. You really kind of are dictating a future. And that was a big quandary for the church early on, also caused a lot of tension. So this urgency of the idea, this conviction that said we want to make sure we shape the future over the young Catholic faithful was a big deal. Even Pope Pius IX even alerted to the state of need in America. He said, every effort must be made to increase the number and quality of parochial schools. Okay, so the Pope was like, we got to do this. But whether or not the schools actually were established and functioned successfully within any kind of diocese, it really depends on the individual commitment of the bishop. And it still does. The priest, as well as the support of the laity. And at the end of the day, when this ideal kind of met the lives of real people, real families, real parishes in many places, the church actually just couldn't meet the need. It couldn't happen. And that's what we kind of want to unpack. Okay, so one of the primary factors upon the development of Catholic schools in the U.S. depended on the work and the presence of religious sisters. I mean, this is just the bottom line. And anyone who knows anything about Catholic schools would say that. Walsh says it would not be difficult to make the case that sister teachers were the single most important element in the Catholic educational establishment. That's amazing. So by 1900, there were more than 40,000 religious sisters staffing parish schools. More than 1,600 of these belonged to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's order, which became this kind of framework for the growth of Catholic schooling during really formative years and all the decades that followed. Just a brief word about St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. If you don't know who she is, she's amazing. Okay, Elizabeth Bailey, born in New York City, August 28th, pretty prominent, like Episcopal family. She lost her mom at the age of 3, and in 1794, when she was 19, she married William McGee Seton, this like super wealthy business guy, and she had 5 kids. Well, William died of tuberculosis in 1803 and leaves Elizabeth, this really young widow, and she discovers Catholicism in Italy, where her husband had died. And she returns to the United States, and she enters the church in 1805 in New York. And after a lot of difficult years, she moves in 1809 to Maryland, Emmitsburg, Maryland, where she founded the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph, the first community for religious women established in the United States. That's a big deal. Okay, so she also began St. Joseph's Academy and Free School and planted the seeds of Catholic education in the United States. She was really one of the first to do that. So her legacy includes religious congregations in the U.S. and Canada, whose members work on the kind of the unmet needs of people living in poverty in North America and beyond. But she's really the mother of early Catholic education. So Mother Seton, as she's often called, she was canonized September 14th, 1975, in St. Peter's Square by Paul VI. She was the first citizen born in the U.S. to be given the title of saint, and her remains are in Emmitsburg in the Basilica at the National Shrine that bears her name. Amazing woman. Okay, so the work of these sisters, her sisters, most of which, their teachers, was heroic. It was just heroic. Okay, they were responding to a massive need, and there was not a labor force to meet that need. So for a lot of decades, there was no real teacher training programs in place. So these teachers relied on kind of a craft system where like novices were mentored by more experienced teachers. It just wasn't possible for the church to expand the school system and to improve the quality of its educators. It just wasn't possible. So simply staffing classrooms took priority. Who's going to teach, right? So these sisters came to their work then with like no training, okay, and varying degrees of experience, okay, and often directly from a foreign country. They were coming from their foreign homeland, okay? So you got to wrap your mind around that. Like their sacrifice and dedication, it really carried the Catholic schools into the modern era. It's just, we had a number of sisters still involved in elementary school in the 80s when like equal pay became a very important topic. We started to lose the ability to finance our schools. So at the turn of the century, way back when, Catholic education in America grew a ton, so much so that the report of the U.S. Commissioner of Education had to acknowledge this massive initiative. I mean, so many kids were going to Catholic schools, right? So decades of growth created a situation the need for organization. Like they needed to kind of get it together. It wasn't just a bunch of mission schools at parishes. So it initiated this kind of movement of centralizing, and that led to school boards and superintendents and so on and so forth. And the National Catholic Education Association, we'll talk more about that later, all kinds of stuff. So furthermore, as the world changes and there's all kinds of things going on, economic depression, world wars, all kinds of new philosophies, there's a lot of new educational approaches, and they're growing up in abundance. The great work of John Dewey, like all these other kind of famous folks. Leaders in the Catholic Church were really kind of faced with tough questions about like what the future parochial schools were, like what's their content, what's their purpose. And a lot of folks within the church were really eager to imitate and to kind of learn from experimentation that was already happening in public schools, different strategies, while others were kind of like, no way, not within American culture. There's too many dangers of materialism. We're not going to do this. It's self-indulgent. There's so much immorality. They're just kind of weary of accepting what might become kind of moral disaster. So everyone recognized that Catholic schooling was really important. It was a necessity if the church was to survive and flourish in Protestant America. But the real question was, what is Catholic schooling? Like what does set us apart? And it was agreed that it didn't mean simply just secular education with prayers and the catechism tacked on. But what it did mean, it wasn't actually really answered. And that's really kind of true today because it's different everywhere. There's not just one methodology for Catholic schooling. So in a lot of ways, the second half of the 20th century caused what Walsh said, he says, caused Catholic educators to question the viability and survival of the parish schools that they had worked so hard to preserve. That's kind of a big deal. So this rapid growth of the 1950s, they couldn't sustain Catholic schools. They were becoming kind of an economic burden on a lot of faith communities and people. They just weren't really sure that they wanted or needed them. I mean, we're talking very, very expensive. So the decline in religious vocations left a lot of schools without any teachers. And the secularization of public schools really kind of removed kind of those initial threats of like proselytization, okay, of being proselytized and the conflict that had sort of driven the early growth of parish school systems. So, state schools were really very much secular schools. So Walsh says, and this is kind of brilliant, he says how, values and ideas were really changing. So there's this changing story of Catholic schools that goes with that. Schools which had depended on great sacrifices, he says, of time and money, the heroic self-gift of so many persons that were certain of the value of this work, and the conviction of families that the development of the soul mattered infinitely more than that of a career. Walsh says, the future of Catholic schools then rests on the foundation of parental commitment. What a great line. Welcome to the modern discussion on youth ministry too, okay? At the end of the day, it's the parents, right? Who are the primary educators. That language found its way into our National Directory of Catechesis. Parents are the primary catechists for their kids, right? They have to want Catholic education for their kids if they want schools to survive. And that is really kind of the bottom line. You either want that or you don't. And in wanting it, you frame its vision. So it's really important to note that Walsh writes this book in 1996. Okay, so that's kind of a big deal because it's a couple decades later, and there's way more to be said, studied and shared about how Catholic schools have basically grown in the 21st century. But for years, you have to understand, like what he's writing gives a pretty thorough overview and kind of a foundation of the discussion. It's worth noting the way he's talking about this in 1996 drives up. It's driven by a strong sense of conflict. I mean, there's like a power struggle going on here. Some of it with parents, some of it with public schools, the ethnicity that's within the schools. But it's fascinating to unpack the conversation because here's the thing: I've been to a lot of Catholic schools across the country, and some of them are just breathtaking. And the hot topic is always Catholic identity, right? What's the Catholic identity of our school? Do we really recognize that we worship Jesus Christ on the altar, in our prayers, through the Eucharist? Or are we just trying to raise a standard of education that costs more money because women religious are nowhere near the numbers that they were to run our schools? And if that's the case, are we catering to the rich? Which is kind of grotesque when you think about it, because some of the most famous saints that were really founders of Catholic education in the United States did so for slaves and Native Americans. I mean, the whole idea was to lift up the poor. In many places, not all places, but in many places, our Catholic schools are a hub for the wealthy. And we've really lost the Catholic family, the working family's desire to afford their kids the education. It just simply is what it is. And friends, I mean, I have so many acquaintances that work in Catholic schools, and every time we talk about it, it's the same conversation about Catholic identity versus, financial viability. That is tough. Now, listen, there are some amazing American saints that have come through and advocated for Catholic education, and you need to know who they are. St. John Newman, missionary and fourth bishop of Philadelphia. He founded really the first diocesan Catholic school system in U.S. He was amazing. He learned pretty quick what it meant to follow God with his whole heart. He was a pretty amazing guy. He was certain that he was called to be a priest, but when the time came for ordination, his bishop got sick and the ordination was canceled, and it was never rescheduled because there was an overabundance of priests in Europe. So knowing he was meant to be a priest, St. John travels all the way from Bohemia to New York City to be ordained, and he was one of only 36 priests serving 200,000 Catholics. His parish stretched from Lake Ontario throughout Pennsylvania, and he became the founder of the diocesan school system. Isn't that amazing? Going from only 2 schools to 100 schools in his diocese. The history of Catholic schools in the diocese, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, is unbelievable. It used to be free education up until not too long ago. Pretty amazing. St. Catherine Drexel, one of my favorites, school builder, founder of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for Indians and colored people. When she asked Pope Leo XIII to send more missionaries to Wyoming, he asked her, "Why don't you become a missionary?" as a young, kind of wealthy, educated girl from Philly. She probably came out of John Newman's school system. This was hardly expected for her, but raised in a devout family with a super deep sympathy for the poor, she gave up everything and became a missionary to the Indians and African Americans. She founded schools in 13 states for African American communities, 40 mission centers in 23 rural schools. She also established 50 missions for Native communities in 16 different states. She died at the age of 96, and she was canonized in the year 2000. Wow. So here's the thing. If you are attuned to any of the data of the last 15 years regarding young people and church and retaining them in church, and you know a lot of this data from even listening to this podcast or just anything in the church, the facts are that what like great minds like Christian Smith and his work with the National Study of Youth and Religion, Kara Pugh, some of the Notre Dame data that Christian now works with, what he'll say about Catholic schools is he'll say a young person who comes up through Catholic schools in the modern era may have a slightly higher percentage of calling themselves Catholic later in life. That was literally all that he was able to concede regarding Catholic identity. And that, to me, is troubling. We have a sense that Catholic schools are the salvation of our kids' religiosity, their desire to stay connected with faith community. And I am not anti-Catholic school. I'm pro-Catholic school. But if we think that Catholic schools are a solution to retaining young people, we are grossly mistaken. The reality is, are we creating parish communities that are welcoming to families and young people? Is the spirit alive? Are we inspiring hearts to invest? A Catholic school won't fix that. And the times have changed. Catholic schools cost a lot of money, and where money is available and they can support great Catholic education, and I've seen it, oh my goodness, some of my favorite schools across the country, they blow my mind how amazing the young people are and how beautiful they pray and what they're doing with campus ministry. But where they're not and still calling themselves Catholic education and living off of the dollars of non-practicing families or non-Catholic families, I'm not sure I understand how we're fulfilling the long mission of really garnering and owning the future of the church. I don't see it. I don't see it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this is a big deal in the church because we're at a crossroads of spending money and investing in where we can best form our young people. And our religious education programs in our parishes are modeled after Catholic schools. And one might argue, in fact, many bishops have, that what we do in RE, once CCD, we did a show on that also, is really ineffective. It's not the correct strategy for evangelizing and inviting. So man, I throw that all out to you. I love our Catholic school systems that are well led and inviting and well funded, but I got to tell you, I think innovation is in the air. And I don't think it means going backwards. I think it means truly creating hospitable parish environments for the future. Woo! That's a good hot topic. I like that one. Don't forget to visit renovopodcast.com for past episodes. Please subscribe to, review, and rate our podcast. We always appreciate your input. Your topic, suggestions, questions, and or comments are always welcome at doug@renovopodcast.com. Learn more about me on Twitter and Instagram at DTOOKE and the number 1. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.